Okay. Hello and welcome to episode 79 of Question and Answer. I'm going to check just to make sure it really is 79. And yes, it is. It's episode 79. And I'm your host, Panyo Basa. And I should just say right off the bat that I still have not fully recovered from whatever disease I got more than 2 weeks ago. I think it's some kind of virus, and I think it may be something that escaped from one of those biolabs because it's like a really bad cold that I have almost no resistance to. It's like I've never encountered this kind of strain of virus before. But I am much improved over 2 weeks ago. I'm down to about between 10 and 15% as sick as I was 2 weeks ago when I was too sick to do a Q&A. So, having told you that, just to give myself an excuse for not being as lively and perky as I usually am. And also, I might as well add that I spent about 3 hours doing videos with my old friend Brian Rue today. So you got that to look forward to. I'll be uploading a few videos with Brian within the next 2 weeks. He's sort of kind of got he's a little bit overwhelmed with videos that he has to edit, so it may not be anytime real super soon, but they're in the can, as they say in the video recording biz. So, I suppose I should start answering questions, because that's why we're all here right now, is for people to attend to me answering questions, or at least attempting to answer questions. And the first question is from Co Vaksh and Sipad Zidana, who says, can you please explain the concept of yoniso manasikara? And yeah, yoniso manasikara excuse me, is mentioned a lot in the suttas. And literally, yoniso means from the origin or from the source. Yoni, those of you who are familiar with the Kama Sutra can also know that yoni in Indic languages can mean vagina, but it doesn't mean that here, so just get the idea right out of your head, even though I may have just implanted it there. And manasikara literally means like attending one's mind, like adverting one's attention to something. Yoniso meaning like from the origin, it means just like wholeheartedly, like, very attentively attending to something. Sometimes yoniso can just be translated as wisely or with wise reflection or something like that. And Co Vakshin Sipad Zidana here wants me to explain the concept, but I think that probably Venerable Ñāṇatiloka in his Buddhist dictionary can explain it better than I can. So I just happen to have the bookmark right here at manasikara. And there are two definitions. One is like the technical Abhidhamma definition of manasikara, and it's attention, mental advertence, reflection. As a psychological term, attention belongs to the formation group, or sankhara khanda, and is one of the 7 mental factors, or cetasika, that are inseparably associated with all states of consciousness, or cetana. Well, I guess it just has s.cetana. In Majjhima Nikāya number 9, it is given as one of the factors representative of mind, or nama. It is the mind's first confrontation with an object and binds the associated mental factors to the object. It is therefore the prominent factor in 2 specific classes of consciousness, i.e. advertence at the 5 sense doors and at the mind door. These 2 states of consciousness breaking through the subconscious life continuum, or bhavanga, form the first state of the perceptual process. So, as it's just like manasikara as an Abhidhamma technical term, it just means like directing your attention to something, and it's present in all conscious mental states that aren't just pure bhavanga, or like I explained bhavanga in a previous Q&A. I think Co Vakshin Sipad Zidana asked about that one also. It's just sort of like a test pattern in your mind when you just happen not to be thinking anything, like when you're in a deep sleep. But yoniso manasikara is definition number 2 here. In a more general sense, the term appears frequently in the suttas as yoniso manasikara, which means wise or reasoned or methodical attention or wise reflection. It is said in Majjhima number 2, to counteract the asavas, the cankers, it is a condition for the arising of right view, of stream entry, and of the factors of enlightenment. Unwise attention is ayoniso manasikara, and it leads to the arising of the cankers and of the 5 hindrances. So essentially it just means like wholeheartedly attending to something, or wholeheartedly directing your attention to something, like listening intently when the Buddha is talking, if you happen to be a disciple of the Buddha. And especially it would mean directing your attention to something that is going to be instructional and uplifting. So that's the explanation. And it's given to you by Ñāṇatiloka, who knew his stuff. So I'll just move on to the next question, which is also from Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana, which is as follows. What parts of the Buddhist text do you think had the most entertaining or relatable stories? What stories stood out to you, not for being profound, but straight up entertaining, funny, etc.? Well, the Udana has lots of interesting stories. A few famous ones, like the story of Bahia, or the blind man and the elephant is in there. Strange story about yakas attacking Venerable Sariputta while he's meditating. Just lots of interesting stories in the Udana. Also, the Dhammapada commentary is just a treasure trove of like ancient Indian folklore, Buddhist stories. I mean, they're considered to be like the origin stories of each verse of the Dhammapada. Also, just Vinaya contains a lot of interesting stories. Like the Mahavagga of the Vinaya Pitaka has like the history of the Buddha's life, starting with his enlightenment, or just shortly before his enlightenment, up to like the formation of the Sangha and starting certain principles like ordination going. Also, there's interesting biography of Jivaka the doctor that is, I think, if I remember correctly, it would be at the beginning of the chapter on medicines in the Vinaya Pitaka. So those would be like my 3 main sources, I guess, of just interesting, entertaining narratives. Would be the stories in the Udana, the stories of the Dhammapada commentary, and also certain parts of Vinaya. And all of them are fairly easy to read too. So if you're practicing Pali, it's relatively straightforward grammar and vocabulary in those texts. So I guess I'll just move on to Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana's 3rd question, which is, I have read some of your written pieces and they are very well put together. Personally, for me to write something like that would take lots of research and days to think over and edit my writing, and it seems super boring. What gives you the motivation to write with such clarity and so extensively, especially given the amount of thought that goes into what you write and how much time it takes? Well, you may notice that I'm really not writing very much at all anymore. I had a blog going that I wrote a blog post every week, and then I stopped that one, and I just liked writing. And so after 6 months or so, I don't remember exactly how long the hiatus was between blogs, I started another blog, which is still online. And at first I was doing a post every 5 days. And I think it was after I stopped being a monk that I extended it to once every week. You know, I'd write a blog post every weekend. And then I haven't written for that blog in months, largely because my weekend time, my free time has been transferred over to making Q&A videos that I now do every week almost. So it takes leisure time. It takes time to just sit around philosophizing, contemplating things. You know, when I was a monk, I didn't have to work for a living. So, you know, I could just sit around most of the time if I wanted to. I mean, a monk really is supposed to spend a lot of time sitting, although generally it would be meditating. But there aren't very many people who can just meditate all the time for years on end. And in a way, it was a way of directing my energies in a positive direction, in a direction that might be of use or benefit, or at least entertainment value to other people. There were certain things that I knew that I thought were valuable, and I decided to share that. And also, when I was a monk, I just felt like giving kind of an unusual approach to like authentic Buddhism. Not just saying the same things that everyone else was saying, and not just like, you know, going out into left field with all kinds of weird stuff that isn't Buddhist at all. But I mean, really, for me, it required having a certain amount of leisure time that I have very much less of now, that I am working for a living and paying bills, and I have a sweetheart that I live with, and just responsibilities. So, I mean, I've got lots of written material that I could make at least 2 more books just with stuff that isn't even on my blog right now, that isn't online anywhere right now. And I just have difficulty coming up with the leisure time even to edit a book out of materials that I already have written. So, yeah, I guess just I've always been good at writing. You know, I got A's in English. I was teacher's pet in English class a lot when I was a kid or when I was a student. And so writing comes relatively easy to me. I'm pretty good at being articulate and enunciating what I'm trying to say. But it does take work, and it does take a lot of time. And I just have less of that time now. And I'm doing most of my work like processing sheet metal now. So, let's see, what was the question again? I forgot the question. What gives you the motivation to write with such clarity and so extensively, especially given the amount of thought that goes into what you write and how much time it takes? The motivation, for one thing, you know, it's like keeping me out of trouble. You know, idle hands are the devil's workshop and all that. And in a way, I just enjoy writing if I have the time and the leisure to do it. I mean, sometimes it's like a chore, it's like work, but it's a kind of self-discipline. And then once you get to the end of it and it comes out pretty good, then there's a satisfaction from having given birth. You know, it might be a painful labor, but once it's born, it's something that gives you a sense of accomplishment and satisfaction also. I might have totally missed that. I mean, there might be something I'm missing, but those are the reasons that immediately come to mind. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Toronto Nat. And Toronto Nat says, what does the Buddhist case against homosexuality look like? And there really isn't much of a case against homosexuality in the Pali texts. I mean, homosexuality, sometimes they say, like in ancient Rome, there wasn't even a concept of homosexuality. There was no word for it in Latin. That it was more like whether you're masculine or effeminate if you're a man. You know, so, I mean, if you were on top, pretty much, then you were playing the role of the man and you were masculine. And if you were on the bottom, so to speak, then you were effeminate. But with regard to the Buddhist case against homosexuality, first of all, there's the Buddhist case against sexuality in general. So sexuality is wallowing in sensuality. It increases desire, it increases attachment, and the first noble truth of Buddhism is that the second noble truth of Buddhism is that all suffering is caused by desire and attachment. So something that increases desire is going to increase suffering, which is counterproductive from a Buddhist point of view as a general rule. So there is the case against sexuality in general, which of course would include homosexuality. Also, there's a case against men who were like sexual deviants, and homosexuality is a deviation from natural heterosexuality. You know, as just from the biological point of view, you know, the purpose of heterosexuality was originally and continues to be primarily for the purpose of reproduction of the species, reproduction of our DNA sequences. And so homosexuality is a deviation from just mainstream traditional heterosexuality, and sexual deviance, and also eunuchs. It's like there's a term pandaka in Pali that means someone who is not fully male, like a castrated eunuch. Like a castrated eunuch cannot be ordained as a monk. If you do not have a pair of balls, you cannot be a bhikkhu, even if you can get some kind of progressive sangha to ordain you. According to the text, it just says very clearly that you are not ordained. The ordination was invalid, null and void. So I think the progressives, if they move on from bhikkhuni ordination, or the ordination of nuns, to trans monks or trans nuns being recognized by the gender by which they identify, that it's just not going to work at all. Even if they think that they're doing it, it's just clearly invalid from the point of view of Vinaya. And I'm kind of digressing here, but it does say, with regard to pandakas, that there's what is called a part-time pandaka. You know, he's a pandaka sometimes. So that wouldn't mean that he has balls sometimes and he doesn't have balls sometimes. It probably means that sometimes he's acting the role of the man, like in ancient Rome, and sometimes he's acting the role of the woman. And that would technically disqualify him from being ordained, although latent homosexuals are ordained all the time. It's just sort of it's like a trope or a meme or something in Burma where homosexuality is kind of frowned upon in a traditional Buddhist society like Burma, and so it's a culturally or socially acceptable way of not getting married by just becoming an ordained monk and being a latent homosexual. Not a practicing one, because then you'd be immediately excommunicated, but you can be a latent homosexual, not get married, not like girls, and in fact it kind of makes things easier to be a monk if you don't like girls. In a sexual way, So that would be essentially the Buddhist case against homosexuality. There's really not much said about it. You know, there's just the warnings against sensuality in general that are just found throughout the suttas, and Vinaya also for that matter. And then there's just this technical thing about pandakas, or sexual deviants, ordaining as monks, that's found in the monastic discipline, or Vinaya. So there's really not much of a case against it, and so progressives in the West will say, you know, that Buddhism is, you know, pro-homosexuality. You know, they've got the queer Buddhist movement and so forth. But that's largely irrelevant, because I'm sure that there are queer Christian movements too. There are queer ministers and so forth, even though the Bible just explicitly calls homosexuality abomination. And the Old Testament says that homosexuals should just be taken out and killed. So people who are really advocates of gay rights and gay pride and all that, they're going to push their case even if the case really doesn't stand up to logical scrutiny very well. Because so long as they can come up with any argument that sounds okay, that's good enough, and they'll consider it to be the clincher. But there's really not much more said against homosexuality than there is against heterosexuality. It's just sexuality in general, from the point of Theravada Buddhism, is considered to be not really conducive to enlightenment. So I guess I've said enough on that one. And I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Al Pacino Alpaca, who is a man of many names. And this is just his most recent name. And Al Pacino Alpaca says, who kept texting you throughout my questions? And he's referring to the previous Q&A that I did, where when I got to his question, a friend of mine texted me like 7 times in a row. So my phone is just making these very distracting sounds. And it turned out that it was an old friend of mine who was a monk in Burma at the same time I was, who he dropped out of the monkhood after 10 or 11 or maybe 12 years. And he just sent me this. I might as well just look it up here. It's pretty easy to find, I hope. I hope I won't be just talking about how easy to find it is and so forth while I'm looking for it. Let's see here. Oh, here it is. All right. So first he sent me a link. That was the first beep. And then he sent me the statement, woke Buddhism eating itself, 4 privileged white people teaching other white people to hate themselves. And it turned out that it's the Berry Center for Buddhist Studies. So it's associated with IMS, the Insight Meditation Society, one of the most prestigious Buddhist organizations in the West, at least among liberal lay people. And it's, see here, it says prerequisites. This program is for people who self-identify as white-bodied only. So it's for whites only, which you would think would be abomination, but it's for the purpose of teaching white people how to be mindful of their own, just like unconscious racism, essentially, and their white privilege. You have to be mindful of white privilege if you belong to if you're a Western Buddhist of a leftist persuasion politically and economically and socially. So, whites only. He says, black Dharma seekers have to drink from the other water fountain of Amrita. And then after that he said, just listen to your vid with Rue, inspired me to send this, might be an interesting topic for your next video. Which actually it turned out not to be, because we did videos about other things, but it's still possible. And that's just common. You can find this sort of thing, retreats for only black people or retreats for only gay people. But this is the first time I've ever seen a retreat only for white people, although I think I've probably encountered them before, but this is the first time I really clearly remember seeing a retreat only for white people, but it's for the purpose of teaching white people that they're racist and have white privilege and so forth, and they have to be mindful of this white privilege that, frankly, I don't really see it existing as something that you can really be mindful of. It'd be more of an exercise in imagination. So, that was my old friend, Venerable Kemadipa, who now goes by a different name because he's not a monk anymore. So I'll just move on to Al Pacino Alpaca's next question here. Is it possible to get jhana while doing walking meditation? And I think it would be possible to get first jhana, but the thing is, my definitions of jhana are not the orthodox definitions of jhana, and the orthodox definitions of jhana are still somewhat controversial, so that people can't exactly agree on what is and is not jhana. So, it's jhana is almost a useless term, because people really do not agree on what exactly it means. From my point of view, the 4 jhanas were originally just the 4 levels of meditation. That first jhana was just doing beginning level meditation well enough that you're actually meditating and not just sitting there spacing off thinking about other things. So yeah, from my point of view, you could get first jhana while doing that. You might even get second jhana while doing that. But the deeper the jhana, the higher the jhana, the more difficult it would be to get while walking. It may be that a real adept, a real master of jhana, could do walking meditation while in a relatively high jhanic state. But again, even the term jhana is controversial. It's almost a useless term, it seems to me. But I don't see why you couldn't theoretically at least, go into a deep mystical state while doing walking meditation. I've done walking meditation while not thinking. Your mind is just wide open. Your body's just sort of, it's like the back part of your brain is just working your legs and stuff, and you're walking back and forth while in a relatively deep meditative state. So I don't see why not. So I'll just move on to Chino Alpaca's next question, which is, which Christian mystic, apart from John of the Cross, would you recommend to read? And then he's got Meister Eckhart ? And yeah, Meister Eckhart is really, he was an adept master of mystical contemplation. So yeah, you could get a lot of benefit from reading Meister Eckhart. Also, the Pseudo-Dionysius, who is practically the father of Christian mysticism. There were mystics before the Pseudo-Dionysius. Even Paul of Tarsus is considered to be a mystic, partly because of this cryptic statement he says in one of his letters, I should say. Also, there are some Eastern Orthodox monks and patriarchs that were very mystical. I think, where is it? That same monk that I knew in Burma, he's an American. I have this notebook, of just quotes and things that when I would read a book that I didn't own and I came across something that I really liked, I'd write it down. And then I lent the book to him, and he took the liberty of writing some quotes himself. And one of them is from St. John Cassian, the Philokalia from the 4th century, which apparently he was mystically inclined. And also, he has one quote from the Archimandrite Dionysius, who was an Orthodox elder. And if you read even, what's his name? Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton has a lot to say about mysticism. He himself apparently was too much of an intellectual, just too much addicted to words to really be a good mystic, but he had some appreciation for mysticism and wrote about mysticism in some of his books. And so, he would be an interesting read of a Christian monastic who at least knew some historical stuff and philosophical stuff about Christian mysticism. But I'd say that the 3 top Christian mystics that I can think of that I'm familiar with would be St. John of the Cross, Meister Eckhart, and the Pseudo-Dionysius, especially his Mystical Theology, which is a short book. It's a short, it's not even a book, it's just a short read. You can read the whole thing probably in, 15 minutes. So, yeah, that's what I would say to that. That's my answer to that, and I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Fred. And Fred says, I have seen a statement that Nibbana is a dhatu. What's your thoughts? Well, dhatu is usually translated into English as element. So, Fred has seen a statement that Nibbana is an element, and there are references to Nibbana dhatu, the element of nirvana. And it's referring to Nibbana or nirvana as a metaphysical state and not as an ethical state. I've mentioned before that there's 2 ways of interpreting nirvana. One is just the act of, or the occasion of becoming enlightened. It's blowing out. When you blow out, that is your nirvana. But also nirvana is a metaphysical state of ultimate reality. And there are descriptions of Nibbana in both senses, going way back into early Buddhism. The Udana that I mentioned a little earlier has several passages referring to Nibbana. In fact, the Bahia Sutta ends with one of those poetical descriptions of Nibbana as, where there is, the sun doesn't shine, the moon doesn't glow, the stars don't twinkle, earth, water, wind, and fire gain no foothold, and so forth. That would be more of a description of Nibbana dhatu than of just the moment of enlightenment or the ethical state of becoming enlightened. More of a psychological state. You got the psychological state, and then you've got the metaphysical state. And so Nibbana dhatu would be more of an emphasis on the metaphysical state as opposed to the psychological state. So Fred's next question here is kind of a strange one. A billiard ball has nothing in between your balls except momentum. What's your thoughts? And I assume he's not referring to my balls specifically, but I'm not exactly sure what he's referring to exactly though. Is a billiard ball has nothing in between your balls. Maybe it's two balls. It's like you hit one, or you hit cue ball, and then it hits a billiard ball, and then the only thing that's really exchanged is momentum. You know, it's like the momentum of the cue ball goes into the, let's say, the red ball, and then the cue ball stops, or in a lot of cases the cue ball stops, and then the red ball moves ahead at the same trajectory as the cue ball if it's hit straight on. And momentum, as I remember from college physics, is mass times velocity. I mean, that's the equation for momentum is a really simple one. It's mv, mass times velocity. So if something has the same mass and the same velocity as something else, they would have the same momentum. But still, I'm not exactly sure what he's asking here. A billiard ball has nothing in between your balls except momentum. And I assume that's the only thing that is like passed on from one ball to the next. When you hit it with one ball, the momentum is what is carried on to the other ball. Sort of like karma is the momentum of your mind, and that's what goes on from one life to the next. You know, like instead of one momentum going from one billiard ball to the next, it's one karmic stream, one stream of consciousness, so to speak, that is passed on from one life to the next. I mean, that's all that passes on. I mean, there is no transmigrating soul in Buddhism, and so it's just the momentum of your karma that moves from one life to the next, sort of like the momentum of billiard balls. So I don't know if I answered that question. That was a strange one. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Pranav. And Pranav says, if someone wants to get a birth in Brahma realms, which path is best, the jhana one or the Brahma Vihara one, or they have to follow both? Well, in order to be reborn in a Brahma realm, you have to die in a state of jhana, or at least having mastered jhana. And it doesn't matter what kind of jhana it is. And so just practicing metta meditation without attaining jhana with it, you would not get into a Brahma realm. You have to have jhana to get into a Brahma realm. And the different Brahma realms represent the different levels of jhana. They're like several different Brahma realms, and your advancement in jhana determines which Brahma realm you'll get into. So if you wanted to get into a Brahma realm through practicing one of the Brahma Viharas, and the Brahma Viharas are metta, karuna, mudita, and upekkha, or loving kindness, compassion, like sympathetic joy, where you're happy because someone else is happy. And then upekkha is just equanimity. So you have to have one of those as your meditation object, and then attain a state of jhana with those as your meditative object. And if I remember correctly, the Visuddhimagga says that the first three, loving kindness, compassion, and sympathetic joy, you can get up to third jhana, and it's only upekkha or equanimity that will get you all the way to fourth jhana. And but nevertheless, you can get jhana from practicing meditation on your breath. You can get jhana from just focusing on like a colored disc as a kind of hypnotic circle. So I mean, any of those is good enough to get you into the Brahma realms, but just practicing metta meditation and not attaining jhana with it isn't going to get you into a Brahma realm. So you have to get jhana to get into a Brahma realm. So I'll just move on to Pranav's next question here. What experience did you have in your best meditations? Was it jhanas? And again, trying to, talking about jhanas is almost useless, because my definition of jhana might not agree with somebody else's definition of jhana. And I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to blow my nose. This is what happens. This is what happens when you have a body, at least a human body, or a body that's made out of meat on this planet. Okay. So, what experience did I have in my best meditations? Was it jhanas? I would guess that it was at least second jhana. I mean, in my very best meditations. But I mean, as a monk, I couldn't even say that publicly, because a monk isn't allowed. It's against Vinaya. It's a pachidiya offense for him to admit to having attained jhana to unordained people. So maybe it was jhana. I think some people would say yes, other people would say no. But what experience did I have in my best meditations? I've explained it before, what my best meditation was like. It's like when you're sitting there not thinking anything. Your mind is just clear, silent, and still, and you are just wide awake and not thinking anything. And sometimes, just through the force of karma or whatever, a thought will start to arise, and it's like you're looking out across the surface of a pond, and like a big fish starts to come up close to the surface, and like ripples start to form. That's like the beginning of a thought. You can see like the ripples in your consciousness starting to form as a thought starts to emerge, but then you just aware of it immediately, and it just fades right back out again. So that was essentially what my best meditation was. You're just sitting there essentially wide awake, clear and silent and still and empty. I had some considerably good meditation, like the most recent good meditation that I had was I would just be able to note anything that arises, just note it, let it go, and just I mean, there'd still be thought processes and like perception and stuff going on, so that couldn't have been above first jhana, even assuming that there was any jhana involved at all in the course of my practice. But yeah, the best meditations I ever had is just you're just wide awake and your mind is just clear like glass. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from the proto-pseudo-monk, who I believe is the very same person as Mr. Cool Whip. So Mr. Cool Whip didn't stop asking questions. It's just that his name appears in the YouTube comments now as proto-pseudo-monk. And his question is as follows. What year as a monk did you graduate from the Mahasi noting mindfulness to advanced open awareness mindfulness? He's got another question mark following this. So this could be like a compound question. Is Sotapanna a requirement for graduation? The meditation practice that leads to enlightenment that you describe aligns more with Mahayana style techniques like Mahamudra, Dzogchen, Zen, or even Advaita Vedanta and yoga. Okay, so that's two questions and an observation. So the first question, what year as a monk did you graduate from the Mahasi noting mindfulness to advanced open awareness mindfulness? And I never formally practiced the Mahasi method except for a few intensive retreats that I attended. I think I might have said intended. But I was ordained in the Tampulu tradition, and I mainly was following Tampulu at first, and then just through trial and error mostly, a little bit of intuition and insight, I just came up with my own style of meditation, which just for whatever reasons happened to be very similar to the style of meditation that was advocated by Mahamyain Uzodika in Burma, who was also ordained in the Tampulu tradition. I don't know if that is totally coincidental or not, but I did not graduate from the Mahasi method because I only practiced it for a matter of a few months. I mean, intensively, because for the most part, I really did not have an extremely high opinion of the Mahasi method. It's good for beginners and it's good up to an intermediate level, but I'm pretty sure that even the Mahasi teachers themselves will admit it does not lead all the way to enlightenment. that Mahasi Sayadaw himself was not considered to be fully enlightened, and so he couldn't really teach people how to get more advanced than he was. So, yeah, I did Mahasi style noting mindfulness, where you're labeling stuff and then just directing your attention at stuff until finally you get to a point where, I mean, you just don't have to do that anymore. Like St. John of the Cross in one of his books is giving advice on when to move from meditation to contemplation. And the difference in Roman Catholicism, in the contemplative schools or the contemplative orders, is that with meditation you're still thinking, but when you get to contemplation you're not thinking anymore. So, and his advice was partly, I mean, you just start getting bored with thinking. You just want just silence. I mean, you start having these yearnings for just stillness and silence, and that's one of the signs that you're ready to move on to contemplation. So, let's see. Yeah, I mean, what year as a monk did I graduate from Mahasi noting mindfulness? I mean, there was no year because I didn't graduate from the Mahasi method. Although, how long was I meditating before I started, or before I stopped labeling, and then how long was I a meditating monk before I stopped just like noting in the Mahasi method of directing your attention at something and just sort of noting it verbally or non-verbally. You know, like the Mahasi method says, when you're noting something, it takes attention and effort, and you've got to like be hitting the object like you're hitting it with a stick. And I mean, that's just making karma because it requires effort. But the best, highest meditation, I mean, you're not using like deliberate effort to do anything, because that's still at the level of samsara. You're still stuck in samsara so long as you're stuck in deliberate effort. So what exact year did I get to the point where I wasn't thinking in my meditation anymore? I really can't say. It was within the first 10 years, definitely. Maybe, I don't know, few years, several years, less than 10. I can't say exactly, I don't really remember. But it was certainly less than 10 years. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question here. I'll just have to make a space, separate the questions. Okay, so the second question here is Sotapanna a requirement for graduation? I guess he's talking about the Mahasi method. And I think they pretty much define, here, I'll get this pillow out of the way so the dog can get up onto the chair. Yeah, I'm pretty sure the Mahasi method defines a graduate of the Mahasi method as someone who has become a Sotapanna. And that has resulted in some strange results, like Sotapannas doing things that Sotapannas can't possibly do. Or I know of at least 2 Burmese monks that were declared Sotapannas by U Pandita himself, Mahasi U Pandita, and then later they realized that they weren't really Sotapannas. So I guess Sotapanna is, or at least to be considered a Sotapanna, it just goes hand in hand with graduating from the Mahasi method. I've heard that the Pa-Auk method, if you graduate from the Pa-Auk method, usually you're considered to be a Sotapanna, but not necessarily. At least there is some acknowledgement that not everyone who graduates the course, so to speak, becomes a Sotapanna in the Pa-Auk method, but I don't think it's that way in the Mahasi method. In fact, for a while, the main Mahasi center in Rangoon was handing out like Sotapanna diplomas. You know, you finish the course, you get the certificate announcing or declaring that you were a Sotapanna. They don't do that anymore though. So, is Sotapanna a requirement for graduation? To be considered a Sotapanna by the instructor is essentially the same as graduating. You pretty much have to be a Sotapanna to completely graduate the course, because you'd have to experience all of the Vipassana insight knowledges in the correct order and essentially fit the qualifications laid down in certain commentarial texts for becoming a Sotapanna. So then he's got this statement that isn't a question. The meditation practice that leads to enlightenment that you describe aligns more with Mahayana style techniques like Mahamudra, Dzogchen, Zen, or even Advaita Vedanta and yoga. Unfortunately, Theravada got sidetracked a bit with self-hypnosis, in my opinion. A lot of what passes for jhana in a country like Burma really is just self-hypnosis. They really can't tell the difference. Or a lot of Burmese meditation teachers cannot tell the difference between jhana and hypnotic trance. And I guess that's one reason why so few Burmese meditation teachers teach just this wide open, essentially mystical contemplation that, like Mr. Cool Whip here, or Proto-Pseudo-Monk says, is more associated with like Dzogchen or like certain kinds of Zen meditation like Shikantaza. But I mean, it's the higher up you go in different traditions, the more they converge. So yeah, I'm not aware of I'm not familiar with advanced yoga meditations, but yeah, I mean, the highest form of meditation would be a kind of mystical contemplation where you've just gone beyond the thinking mind altogether, even like the emotional feeling mind too. I mean, you're just getting into as close to pure consciousness as it's possible to get. And I mean, you can do that in almost any tradition, so long as you're practicing correctly. And some people don't even need the instruction. They can just learn through their own experience or through intuition or just good karma. They just stumble upon it, where they get into these very advanced meditative states or just, rarefied mystical states. And Christians have done it too. I assume it's there have been prehistoric shamans who have attained these states also. So, yeah, I mean, it's not really something that is very well codified or systematized. That, I mean, the more advanced you get, the less system there is, practically by definition. So, I guess I'll just move on to Proto-Pseudo-Monk alias Cool Whip's next question here. I think he's got 4 questions. Gosh, that's a transgression to ask 4 questions. The limit is technically 3, although we really do not have a huge number of questions this time. So I can be lenient, I suppose. There will be no punishment meted out on this case. Not yet, unless I change my mind. So the next question here is, do you recommend that we learn from these traditions that reify the ultimate is instead of isn't, or derive the mindfulness practice simply from the Satipatthana Sutta without the noting? Well, I mean, whatever works for you, whatever helps you to progress, to attain what you're trying to attain, it's going to be useful. I mean, there's a lot of wisdom in Mahayana. I'm not just going to say that, Mara invented Mahayana to lead people astray or any such thing. Certain schools of Mahayana, I think, have a lot of wisdom. Not all of them, in my opinion, but certain ones do. And I mean, if you're in a mystical state, if you're not thinking anymore, you're not reifying anything, you're not philosophizing at all. So it's like the dogmatic philosophy is like in a completely different category from the experiences that you're experiencing when you're doing good meditation. It's like they're practically irrelevant to each other. So, yeah, I mean, regardless of whether you're a Vedantist Hindu or a Theravada Buddhist or a Zen Buddhist or a Tantrayana Buddhist, if you're in a relatively deep contemplative state, you're having a genuine mystical experience, then, I mean, you're not dogmatizing at all. You're not philosophizing, you're not thinking about whether the absolute is or isn't. You're just having the experience that really can't be put into words after you come out of that experience anyway. So even though you experience it directly, I mean, you still can't describe it in a valid way. So, yeah, I mean, if it works for you, I mean, if you're practicing, I mean, there's nothing wrong, there's nothing against Theravada to practice Zen Shikantaza, for example, where essentially you're just sitting there observing your own mind. And there's some of that in Theravada also, although there aren't very many teachers who are teaching it, because Theravada is a relatively dogmatic system, and they like dogmatic traditional ways of teaching certain traditional ways of meditation. But like in the commentaries, which is kind of ironic that the commentaries would teach something really profound like this, but it does happen sometimes. There's the story of Potila, Tucha Potila, who was this scholar monk, which is kind of an anachronism in the Buddhist time, but still, I mean, he was just an intellectual. He was like a savant. He was, a respected senior monk, but the Buddha would always call him Pointless Potila. Here comes Pointless Potila, there goes Pointless Potila, because, he was kind of, in a way, teasing Potila that, I mean, he was dedicating all of his energies to just memorizing discourses and so forth, and he wasn't a good meditator. So the Potila finally, it struck home. He decided he better go out and learn how to meditate well. So he walks some god-awful distance. I don't know why he walked that far. It's just an embellishment in the commentaries, I suppose. Comes to a monastery where all of the Sangha there are arahants. And he goes to the senior one, and the senior one says, no, you're like this elder teacher, and I'm not going to try and teach my elders. Ask a different monk. And he goes through the entire Sangha, and they all refuse to teach him until he gets to this, like a 9-year-old novice who's also enlightened. And the 9-year-old novice gives him the advice of, it's like catching a lizard that's inside of a termite mound. And then there's 6 holes to this termite mound. And so you just block off 5 of those holes, and you just keep very careful attention on the only open hole. And as soon as the lizard comes out, you grab it, you catch it. And that's just like an analogy for a certain kind of meditation that I used to call third gear, where you're just observing the mind. It's like you're in a library and you've got a loudspeaker hooked up to your brain, so that every time you think, it's blasted over this loudspeaker, and there's this big scary librarian with like the beehive hairdo and the pointy glasses on the chain and the big flowery dress like a tent, and she's just glaring at you every time you think something. So that, I mean, you just sit there observing your mind carefully and just trying to catch every thought as it arises. And if you're just really in this state of yoniso manasikara, where you're just intently adverting your mind to observing your own mind, then it just prevents you from thinking. I mean, you can try this yourself. Just close your eyes, and then just try to catch the next thought that arises. And if you watch your mind carefully, waiting to see what the next thought is, then nothing arises until your mind starts to wander, and then the thought arises almost behind your back. So, again, I think I've deviated or just digressed here. But even that meditation technique isn't really the most advanced one that I ever came across, because you're still attending to something. And when you get to the highest level, you're not even attending to anything. Your mind is just wide open and clear like glass or a mirror or something. So I guess the question, I'll read the question again. Sometimes I just my answer lasts so long that by the time I get to the end of it, I've forgotten what I'm answering. Do you recommend that we learn from these traditions that reify the ultimate is instead of isn't, or derive the mindfulness practice simply from the Satipatthana Sutta without the noting? And either way will work. I mean, whatever works best for you. You have to practice and use a little trial and error of your own to find out what works best for you, because one size does not fit all. That's one of the main mistakes of the Mahasi method, in that, like U Pandita, he'd give the same meditation technique to almost all of his students, and then if they weren't making progress with it, he'd scold them for not making progress. It's sort of like a doctor who gives the same medicine to all of his patients and then scolds them for not getting better, from him giving everybody the same medicine. And it really doesn't work that way. That's why the Buddha had various meditation techniques that he would teach to various monks. But he had the advantage of being able to just look into your mind and seeing where you were stuck and just knowing intuitively how to get you unstuck. So, yeah, my answer to that question is, whatever works for you. You can try both ways and see which way works better. So I'll just move on to Cool Whip, or the Proto-Pseudo-Monk's last question here. Venerable Sir, can you please concede us the advanced esoteric mindfulness practice that leads to enlightenment, or has our karma not ripened yet? Well, it's more a matter of practice than being able to learn the technique, because as I was just saying, the more advanced you get in your meditation, the less actual technique there is, until finally you're just sitting there still and silent, wide open. And there's no moving parts. There's nothing that you're actually doing. So, yeah, you have to start off with a relatively elementary meditation technique, and then once you are able to do that without your mind wandering away, you're able to do that fairly consistently, then you can make it less busy, without labeling. You're observing the breath, but you're not labeling it, for example. You're not thinking breathing in, breathing out anymore. You're just observing the sense of touch around your nostrils as you're breathing, and then your mind becomes quieter. And when you can do that skillfully, then you might move on to third gear, like the termite mountain with the lizard, where you're just sitting there intently observing your own mind, trying not to think. And then when you get good at that, you can move on to fourth gear, as I used to call it, which is just sitting there wide open. But it takes practice. You can't just move straight to the advanced level. You can't take someone who is not good at math and just throw them into a calculus class. First you got to learn arithmetic, and then algebra, maybe some analytical geometry, and work your way up to calculus as you get better and better. Or like Euclid, you don't just start at the end. You got to gradually get better and sort of develop your practice so that you can actually do it. So yeah, it's just a kind of gradual practice where you start off when your mind is just undisciplined and busy. You have to give it busy work to do to keep it occupied, so that you're actually keeping your mind directed at something. It's almost like mental calisthenics, like jumping jacks or push-ups or something. And then gradually, as your mind gets more disciplined, then you have less and less busy work for your mind to do, until at the end your mind isn't doing any work at all. It's all effortless. But it's not just, you don't just jump right into the effortless. It takes lots and lots of practice. It takes a lot of hard work to get to the level of effortlessness. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question, which is kind of a strange one. I don't think anyone's asked this one before. This is from Rui. And Rui says, "Hello, Panyo, here is a simple one. Is there any rule other than common sense for a mendicant living in the wilderness regarding defecation?" And for those of you who are unfamiliar with fancy posh talk like defecation, it means taking a dump. Pooping, if you will. And yeah, there's rules with regard to just about everything, including taking a dump. Although most of the rules are with regard to using an outhouse. So if you're just crapping on the ground like an animal, there's not a whole lot of rules governing that. There still are rules, like you're not supposed to make grunting noises. You're not supposed to strain unless you're more constipated than usual. You're supposed to wipe your behind. Let's face it, nobody likes a person with a shitty behind. So it just makes sense that you should wipe. Although technically you're supposed to use a stick, because in ancient India, when they invented these rules, they didn't have toilet paper yet. And first you use a stick, and then you just do the final rinse with a cup of water. And in Burma, most outhouses, at least monastery outhouses, they've got a big water pot and like a half of a coconut shell, and you wipe using water. And it does work fairly well, especially if you're not wearing underwear, that you can just kind of dry off as you walk around after you've rinsed your behind, rinse the narrow place, so to speak, with water. And I mean, poop is water soluble, it rinses right off. It works fairly well. So, yeah, most of the rules are with regard to using an outhouse. So, I mean, you can't wear your upper robe in an outhouse. You're not supposed to wear your shoes in an outhouse. You're supposed to not throw the butt wiping sticks down into the hole. There are, I guess one of the best known rules regarding defecation in a forest is you're not supposed to crap onto green plants or into water. You're not supposed to crap into water. So, or pee into water. And my nose just keeps plugging up for some reason. Excuse me. And I hope next week I will be completely recovered from whatever virus I happen to contract. I think one reason why I've been getting sick lately is this new sheet metal shop I work at. It seems like most of the employees have small children or are small grandchildren. And as we all know, children have no sense of hygiene, and they're like little toddling petri dishes. So there's a lot of pathogens going around. So anyway, getting back to the important topic of taking a dump here. There are rules. In fact, most of the rules are with regard to outhouse etiquette. But even if you're just crapping on the ground like an animal, there's still certain rules like the grunting rule, and you're supposed to wipe, and you're not supposed to crap on the green plants or into water, especially if it's water that might contain living beings, because you might be like grossing out those living beings in that water by doing your business. If not actually like poisoning them to death with the impurities that just came out of your lower digestive orifice. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, although of course we all love to linger on this topic. I'm just going to have to move on here. And the next question from Rui is, this is speculative, but do you think that beyond the suttas that have reached us in the canon, the Buddha addressed the Sangha on a daily basis, or did he remain mostly silent? Well, I think it's fairly sure. I think it's really pretty likely, to say the least, that not everything that he said after his enlightenment is recorded in the Tipitaka. I mean, the Tipitaka is fairly thick. You know, the Burmese edition of the Tipitaka is 40 volumes. So, I mean, it's quite a lot in there, but certainly the Buddha said a lot of stuff that just never got recorded. I don't think that he addressed the Sangha on a daily basis, because there were times when he was just like in silent retreat. You know, he'd just go off into the forest or just stay in his hut or whatever. You know, he didn't encourage a lot of talk, but I'm sure that fairly frequently he would address the monks and give Dhamma talks. And I mean, he was teaching for several decades, and so it's hardly likely that everything that he taught is contained in the Tipitaka, and for that matter, it's hardly likely that everything contained in the Tipitaka is what he actually taught. There's a lot of stuff that has been added. I think there's a question along those lines a little later on about, well, we'll just get to it. So, okay, do I think that beyond the suttas that have reached us in the canon, the Buddha addressed the Sangha on a daily basis? Yeah, I think it's pretty likely. And some people think that the Buddha just repeated himself a lot, because the texts are very repetitive. You know, the Buddha will say verbatim the same thing over and over again in the suttas. And from my point of view, it's mainly just an aid in memorization, because the Buddhist suttas were just orally transmitted and they were just memorized by heart. And it's just easier to memorize something by heart when you've got just formulas that are found again and again in the suttas, that once you've memorized it once, then you've got it down, and you can just plug it into suttas. Like the definition of the 4 jhanas, that is not extremely explanatory. It's just verbatim the same, where you find it in dozens of places throughout suttas. So I think that he was like intuitive. He could read his audience better than most speakers can read their audience, and he would address issues that were coming up, or help somebody in his meditation or that kind of thing, that it just didn't get recorded. And it may be that he was teaching certain things that turned out later not to be convenient. It's just like the philosophy developed and sort of started deviating from certain things the Buddha taught, and so it just sort of got edited out. I mean, that's possible too, because if you read the Atthakavagga, which is an archaic text, there's a lot of stuff that, I mean, it's just not orthodox. But the Atthakavagga was too well known to just remove parts of it, and so they just had to reinterpret. And it's lame reinterpretations, like the commentary to the Atthakavagga. I mean, it just has to do lots of stretching and twisting to try to make sense of what is contained in those suttas, compared with orthodox tradition. So it may be that the Buddha said certain things that just fell by the wayside. I assume this is a similar situation with Jesus of Nazareth, where not everything that they said has found its way into the text, and not everything in the text was actually said by them, which is heresy, but I'm a heretic. I used to have the ambition of becoming a heresiarch, but I'm not really that ambitious anymore. So I'll just move on to Rui's next question here. Did he effortlessly have the pulse of the Sangha by means of psychic powers? Yeah, I would guess he probably did. That he could just look right through, just like Neem Karoli Baba on the top of the bookshelf back there. According to testimonies that I have no reason to doubt, I mean, he could just look right through you. He would know stuff about you that, I mean, your own conscious mind could not acknowledge. He would know you better than you know you. And I assume the Buddha was similar. Of course, all we can do is just guess. It's all conjecture, because he's not here with us for us to observe. And even if he was here for us to observe, we still wouldn't know what's going on inside of his mind. So, but nevertheless, I would guess, based on what I know about the Buddha and about Dhamma in general, that, yeah, I mean, he would be able to look into a person, according to tradition, he did this, that, I mean, for example, there's one case, I think it's in the commentaries, it might be in a sutta, where one of the disciples of Sariputta was taking meditation instructions from Sariputta, who was the Buddha's right-hand man, and he just wasn't making progress. So then finally he went to the Buddha, and the Buddha just, looked into his spirit, so to speak, and gave him a red flower, and said, meditate on this. And just within a short time, he had just broken through the obstacles that were keeping him from making significant spiritual progress. And according to the stories, he became enlightened relatively quickly after the Buddha just gave him a red flower to meditate on, because Sariputta wasn't good at intuitively reading him as well as the Buddha was, and just couldn't just look and see exactly what he needed, what would work best for him. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if the Buddha was like that. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Bodhisattva 969. And Bodhisattva 969 says, is the visible Nibbana in quotes, the eradication of greed, hatred, and delusion, a foretaste of Nibbana, or some other kind of it? Well, the eradication of greed, hate, and delusion would be legitimate Nibbana. That would be like Nibbana in the psychological sense, rather than Nibbana Dhatu in the metaphysical sense. Although, in a very subtle way, there is no difference between the two. which is something I'm not going to try to wade into. I mean, Nibbana is Nibbana. It's not like there's two different Nibbanas. But it's like paradoxical, hard to understand intellectually. So, is the visible Nibbana, the eradication of greed, hatred, and delusion, a foretaste of Nibbana or some other kind of it? I think I just answered that. That was, somehow I feel insecure in short, easy answers. So I just keep talking even though I've adequately answered the question, I think. So, it's, I mean, there's only one kind of Nibbana, although, as I mentioned, there's like two ways of looking at it, as a psychological occurrence, a psychological state, and as a metaphysical state, or the absolute, ultimate reality or whatever. And, but really, there's just Nibbana. I mean, there's just one. So, and one of the main definitions of Nibbana is the eradication of greed, hatred, and delusion, or attraction, aversion, and semi-conscious stupidity. So, I mean, that's Nibbana right there, visible. I don't know how it would be visible, though. I mean, he's got visible Nibbana in quotes, but I don't think it's visible, really. I mean, you could see an enlightened being, assuming that an enlightened being means anything in a samsara context. But that's about as far as it goes. You can't really see Nibbana. It's not a visual datum. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Crave Minerals. And Crave Minerals says, are you aware of any method, in quotes, for choosing what gender to be born as? I would guess it's largely out of one's hands, but anyways. I can think of like two methods, or two ways of being born as a certain gender. And one of them is just, if you're thinking and acting like a member of the opposite gender for long enough, I mean, if you've got like this yearning to be a member of the opposite gender, then, that's creating karma. And it may be, if you're wholehearted enough, you could create sufficient karma that you actually switch in the next life. Because you've already started switching in this life, if you're trans, so to speak. So that would be one way of just, if you're just really dedicated, you just yearning, deep inside to be a member of the opposite gender, then, you'll be creating karma that will be leading in that direction. So that's one possibility. I don't actually recommend it. I mean, you're going to get what you need. So, I mean, it's not necessary to be trying to be reborn as this or that gender. Although, in Asia, traditional Asia, there are a lot of votary tablets, like at archaeological sites of old Buddhist temples, a lot of votary tablets, just little clay tablets that are offered to a shrine or an altar. And a lot of them are from women who are praying to the Buddha to be reborn as men in the next life. So I guess that's one possible way, maybe, although praying to the Buddha really is not endorsed in Theravada Buddhism. But then there's another way that I encountered once. I had one of my main supporters in Burma was a woman who was a very masculine woman. She was, she never got married, and she was just this fierce person. She had to be feuding with somebody pretty much all the time, or else she'd just be bored stiff. And I know enough about her childhood that she was, from the time that she was a toddler, she was ashamed of being a girl. That, if they put girls' clothing on her, or like girls' Thonica bark makeup stuff on her as a little girl, she would just cry and hide until they took it back off of her again. I've seen family pictures of her when she was a little girl. She'd have her back turned to the camera because she was ashamed of being a girl. She wanted to be a boy. She was a tomboy, big time. And I had this idea that it's very possible that it was a kind of karmic retribution, that in the past she was just like a total male chauvinist, misogynist, like a man who just despised women. And as a kind of karmic retribution, she got reborn as a woman as a way of working off this unwholesome karma that she had been cultivating as the male chauvinist, pig misogynist male. So some of you out there who are misogynists, you should be careful, because it's really astonishing to me. I've had insights where you're just astonished at the power of a single thought. And we're thinking all the time, and usually it's just habit driven. We don't realize just how powerful our thoughts are, but they are really determining our reality now and in the future. So you got to be careful. And if you don't know what I'm saying, just take ayahuasca once and see for yourself. That's kind of a joke there. So yeah, that would be my main methods, quote unquote, for choosing what gender you're going to be born as. Although the third one I mentioned would be sort of unintentional. You know, it's like you're not choosing to be born as a woman by hating women, because it's sort of like the opposite. So you have to be careful. But I would say just, you know, let your karma just decide for you, and it will decide more appropriately than your thinking ego could decide. So I'll just move on to Crave Minerals' next question here. Could Kant's thing in itself in any way be of help in gaining perspective about Nibbana, just like it's impossible to think about or in any way grasp the assumed thing in itself with the senses, because it lies beyond the senses? It is likewise so with Nibbana. But from what I've understood, Nibbana isn't excluded from the senses either, otherwise it couldn't possibly be known. Maybe this is a vague question, but could you shed some light on this? Well, yeah, you don't sense Nibbana. In order for you to be able to sense Nibbana, Nibbana would have to be a cause for this sense perception. And Nibbana is not a cause, it's not an effect, it is unconditioned. Neither a cause nor an effect, it's just not part of that scheme of things. So, nevertheless, I do talk about Kant sometimes, and I do think that Nibbana is a thing in itself. Nibbana is itself the Kantian thing in itself, and it's beyond perception. But I do think that Kant was not really a mystic. He was too intellectual to be a mystic, and he didn't realize that there is a way of knowing the thing in itself. He thought there's no way you can possibly know the thing as it really is. All you can know is the thing as it seems, you know, through the categories and through your perceptions and so forth. And the categories, it's Kantian philosophy. I'm not going to wade into that. But Kant did believe that we can't know reality. All we can know is the symbols generated by our mind that are attempts at interpreting this reality. And so he just assumed that that reality was out there, although some of his followers, some of his, I don't know if you call it disciples or not, people like Schopenhauer and Hegel, for example, who, I mean, Schopenhauer hated Hegel, but nevertheless, both of them were profoundly influenced by Kant, and both of them came to the conclusion that since the thing in itself can't possibly be known, you might as well just dispense with it altogether. And they became idealists. Like German idealism was started by Kant, who was not really an idealist, but he might as well have been, because he's saying that, you know, reality outside of your mind is completely beyond your reach. You can't touch it. But as I say, Kant was not a mystic. And so he didn't realize that there is a thing in itself that you can know directly, and that is the thing in itself of your own consciousness. So by training yourself, by making the mind more and more subtle, more and more devoid of perceptual content, devoid of symbols that will distract you, then you're able to see consciousness as consciousness, which is the thing in itself, and not in its various perceptual symbolic forms. Because we get lost in the perceptual symbolic forms and don't see consciousness as the thing in itself that we have direct access to. So that's one way, using Kantian philosophy, that I could try to explain Buddhist enlightenment in accordance with the Western philosophical terminology. But seeing consciousness as consciousness and not as mental states, symbolic perceptual mental states, that's mysticism. That's what mysticism is all about. This direct experience of reality without the intermediary of symbolic perceptions. So, yeah, I mean, the Kant's thing in itself can be of help in gaining perspective about Nibbana or insights about Nibbana. So, I think I'll just move on to Crave Minerals' next question here. Try and breathe through my nose without it like making like these weird like piston feelings in my nose or something. It's weird. Okay, it's like I got valves in my nostrils that are like flipping up and down when I breathe in and out. So let's see here. Do you think practice of metta is a good safeguard against snakes, insects, and various hostile beasts? And just having metta is a good safeguard against snakes, insects, and various hostile beasts. The practice of metta, it depends on whether it's genuine metta that you are practicing, because you can kid yourself into thinking that you're practicing metta just because you're getting like these warm, glowy, feel-good kind of feelings, and you think that you're beaming love in all directions, but really it's just sort of an exercise in imagination and just cultivating this warm, glowy feeling. But if you genuinely love snakes, like I do, I have to admit, whenever I would see a snake in Burma, I would be happy. I would just be like overjoyed practically. And the first time I ever saw a cobra, especially when it was like standing up with the hood spread, I mean, I was just in rapture that day. So just having genuine metta towards snakes and insects and so forth, yeah, I mean, you've got less like antagonistic karma that's more likely to result in, unpleasant encounters. Like most animals, like snakes or spiders or whatever, I mean, spiders might not have like a perceiving mind, but any kind of animal that is conscious, that is more or less sentient, I mean, they're not going to mess with you unless they feel threatened. So, I mean, if there's just like a good vibe coming off you, you're just beaming love at this snake or whatever it is, they're much less likely to like get alarmed and want to bite you. I mean, if you step on one in the dark, then yeah, I mean, all bets are off then. I was stung by scorpions a number of times, but I mean, it was my own fault. I didn't really hold it against the scorpion. Like one time I was building a fire to heat some water or something, and I took a piece of firewood and put it on the fire, and I didn't know that there was like a little scorpion that was under the bark or something, and it crawled out to the very end of the wood, and I didn't see it, and I was rearranging the wood, and I put my thumb right onto it, and it stung my thumb. But I realized, I was dooming it to a fiery death if I didn't even notice it, and then I was like accidentally put my thumb directly onto it. So still, I rescued the scorpion from the fire, so he didn't burn to death. Yeah, so I mean, practice of metta, it depends on how well you're practicing it. If you're cultivating genuine metta towards snakes and so forth. I mean, the Kanda Sutta was one of my favorite paritas or protection chants, which is just sending love to all creatures, with many legs, with 4 legs, with 2 legs, and with no legs. It lists off the various families of snakes and so forth, and you're just sending goodwill and friendliness to all of them. And it's supposed to, according to the texts, protect you from snake bite, and even if you do get bitten, you won't die. That's what it says in the texts. So yeah, I never got bitten by a snake, and I've always really liked snakes. It could just be a total coincidence. But I did get chased by a snake once. It was a little Russell's viper. It was only about this big. It was practically a baby. And Russell's vipers are mean. They're the meanest. They're the most dangerous snake in Burma, even though they're not the most poisonous, because they're just mean, and they'll just actually chase you sometimes. And this little snake, I alarmed it. I'm walking down the trail and suddenly come upon it, And it's just like going like this at me, like coming towards me, like lunging at me. And fortunately, people can move faster than snakes can. And I cleared out pretty easily, and wasn't really in danger. But you have to have mindfulness. So having metta is a good protection against dangerous animals, but also just being mindful and not just stepping on something that you're not supposed to step on, or just blundering into a herd of wild pigs or something. That's good too. So mindfulness and metta definitely can protect you from dangerous, various hostile beasts. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from the Personalization Primitive. And Personalization Primitive says, why do you suppose we aren't all naturally born with mindfulness? Why is it so hard to be mindful for any significant period of time, let alone as the default state of being? I welcome insights from the Buddhist viewpoint, as well as perspectives from evolutionary biology or psychology. Well, I'm kind of hesitant to refer to Abhidhamma in this case, but I will anyway. That according to Abhidhamma, mindfulness is present in every mind moment. Everyone has mindfulness all the time. It's just not very advanced. It's not like pure mindfulness. It's just sort of a crude, functional kind of mindfulness that gets us through life. And if you read the text, the purity of mindfulness is fourth jhana. So you would be in a very advanced mystical state to have pure mindfulness, which is just be here now. And I assume that evolutionarily, we aren't just here now all the time, because we've got to be thinking about the future. Sometimes we've got to think about the past. Sometimes we've got to think about stuff that isn't here. We've got to plan for the future and think about that hostile tribe over in the other valley over there, and how are we going to score heavy with the cave babes and that kind of thing. So, just from the perspective of staying alive and reproducing your DNA sequences, is just not really conducive to evolutionary success to be an arahant, or to have perfect mindfulness all the time. That a certain amount of unmindfulness and just instinct-driven behavior, habit-driven behavior, all of our unwholesome emotions, or most of them anyway, are there for an evolutionary reason. It helped our ancestors to survive. If you're jealous, then it's less likely that your mate is going to be messing around with somebody else so that you'll be raising somebody else's kid, or that your mate will just run off with somebody else. If you've got selfishness, it's more likely that you're not going to let people steal from you, so that you can survive famines better when you're not just letting people steal all your food, that kind of a thing. So it's all there for a reason, and just unenlightenment is built into us. If we were all enlightened, we probably wouldn't have enough greed, hate, and delusion to keep us alive. First of all, we wouldn't have enough lust to even reproduce our DNA sequences. So, we're born with mindfulness, but it's just enough to keep us surviving, well enough that we're evolutionarily successful. But we're not mindful to the point of being, enlightened sages, because that would be just too much of a good thing, and it would start being counterproductive from the point of view of just surviving and reproducing your DNA sequences, going from the evolutionary biology point of view. So I guess I answered that. And my nose is still making those weird things when I breathe in and out. I really do hope that I kick this thing. I'm like I said, I'm down to maybe less than 15% as sick as I was 2 weeks ago. So, but still, there's a little bit of lingering malaise or something. Also today it was very the weather was changing, so I'm feeling a little barometric-y, and also I drank too much coffee and now I'm drinking energy drink. Although the energy drink does seem to be working, to the extent that I feel better than I did when I first started this Q&A. So maybe it's just hanging out with you guys. It just makes me feel better. So, let's see. I'll just move on to personalization primitives. Next question. Among all living individuals, who would be your top choice for a group discussion on your channel? Well, I have to admit, the first group that came to mind I assume a group discussion would be at least 3 people. So if I could do a group discussion on my channel with any other 2 people, I think I'd pick, or at least this was like my initial idea, pick Donald Trump and Styx Hexenhammer. I'm sure we could have a really interesting discussion. Yeah, I think it would be really popular. Trump, Styx Hexenhammer, and me. But then I'm thinking, well, maybe I should probably try and get enlightened sages on this channel. But I'm not sure who the enlightened sages would be. I mean, talking to Ram Dass would have been interesting, but he's been dead for several years. I'm not sure who the enlightened beings are nowadays. Paul Lowe is in his 90s, I think, now. He's getting up there. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't mind talking to Paul Lowe, but I think he's retired. He's just not doing, he doesn't have a video presence anymore. Yeah, so I guess I'll just have to stick with Donald Trump and Styx Hexenhammer. So I'd appreciate it if some of you nice folks would just reach out to them and persuade them to be on my show. And we'll talk about whatever I'll let Trump decide what he wants to talk about. Because, he kind of outranks us socially. So let's see here. Yeah, I guess I answered that one. I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Elias. And Elias says, what do you think about Gnosticism, especially Manichaeism, which places great emphasis on asceticism? Like Buddha, Mani aimed for nirvana and used this word, showing the significance of Buddhist influences. I didn't know that Mani, the founder of Manichaeism, used the word nirvana. It might be a Persian word too. I assume there's a good chance it is. So he further believed in the transmigration of souls, sangha, and used various Buddhist terms in his teachings. And I didn't know this because I really am not a scholar of Gnosticism, especially Manichaeism. I've read just on in historical texts discussing early sects of Christianity and early religions in the Roman Empire and so forth, that Manichaeism was very dualistic, sort of like Zoroastrianism was very dualistic, had a good god and an evil god, and they were always at war with each other. And it was my understanding that Manichaeism was also very dualistic. There was just this duality of good and evil, and that doesn't strike me as being particularly dharmic. I mean, Buddhism talks about skillful and unskillful. Sometimes it'll use words like good and evil, but it really is not. Good and evil really are not deep philosophical terms in Buddhism. With regard to Gnosticism in general, it's my understanding that they considered, they had a position with regard to samsara that was comparable to early Buddhism, where, we're supposed to transcend this pollution of having a physical body so we can move on into the pure spiritual realm, that this world was just a bad place and just a place of pollution and just degradation and so forth. But I really am no expert on Gnosticism or Manichaeism. But it seems to me that the Gnostics had too much of a negative attitude towards this world. Whereas in Buddhism, there's talk about negativity, but it's you need to just simplify it enough that you can just accept it. It's the goal in Buddhism is just to accept whatever happens, including this body and this world. It helps to simplify it by renouncing the world and so forth, so that it makes it easier to cultivate an acceptance of whatever happens. But to think of it as something bad and wrong, a lot of Buddhists look at it that way, but I don't think that is really an enlightened attitude. That you simplify the world through renouncing it, going into a forest and just kind of slowing things down, simplifying things to make it easier to simplify and purify your own mind and to just accept whatever comes along. So it's easier to cultivate sagehood in, simple, quiet surroundings rather than, at the state fair or in the marketplace or something. Living in a house with a family and bills to pay and work and all that is definitely a higher difficulty setting. So, yeah, the Mani, the founder of Manichaeism, he used the word nirvana and all that. I didn't even know that. But I do think that Gnosticism, at least what little I've read about it and what little I've heard about it, it didn't strike me as being like explicitly enlightened. I mean, if that makes any sense, there's all this talk about, different realms and archons and different ranks of angels and so forth, and just the evil of having a physical body. Not just that it's, necessarily causes us to be unhappy, like, the first and second noble truths, but I don't know, it just never really resonated with me all that much. It could be that I was a pagan in ancient Rome and I just have like this antipathy for Christianity and Gnosticism and so forth that's just carried over from a previous life or something. I do have certain feelings about certain things that, it could just be a carryover from a previous existence. Like, I've never really been into bowing to Buddha statues, and it could be in a past life I was really down on idolatry or something, and it's just carried over from that. I don't know. But I have to admit, I'm really no expert on Gnosticism, especially Manichaeism, other than I've been told that Manichaeism was just dualism par excellence, where it's just black and white, good and evil at war with each other. And I really don't think in those terms. I mean, good and evil it's value judgments that are artificially imposed on what we perceive. So, yeah, it could be that he was a much wiser person than I'm aware of, and it wouldn't surprise me at all. I think St. Augustine was a Manichaeist for a while, and he was no slouch philosophically, so he saw something in it that I don't see, obviously. But I think you're better off just with Buddhism or some enlightenment tradition that is still a living tradition, rather than trying to create a replica or resuscitate a tradition that has pretty much died out. I assume there are still like vestiges of Gnosticism in this world, but with regard to Manichaeism, I'm not sure what a vestigial Manichaeism would look like in the modern world. So that wasn't much of an answer, because I really am no authority on Gnosticism or Manichaeism. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And this is from Michael. And I suppose I should check to make sure I'm really recording. And yes, it says I'm recording. Okay. And my nostrils are kind of working. So I think we're doing okay. So anyways, Michael says, I once had an encounter with what appeared to be a negative astral being. Is there a way in which I could discover whether this being is either an unintentional thought form created by my own negative thoughts and feelings, or some kind of demon? And it's weird, but this was under a YouTube video where I was talking to a Devin Wendell, who can see like spirit beings. And he's a kind of, he's sort of like the people in like the Dead Files or Ghost Adventures or something. He's not out just trying to, make a show. He's actually trying to help purify energies in areas, like people have problems with a haunted house or something. He'll go and do what he can do, or like spirit possessions, that kind of thing. He's kind of like almost like an exorcist. But anyway, he left an answer to this. And I think he then shortly afterwards removed it, because I can't find it now. But for a while there was an answer to this question by the other person that was in the video with me, under which this question was posted. This wasn't under a Q&A video, and he was saying that if it doesn't leave the wall, like you have a dark entity, a shadow figure as they're called in the ghost shows, that it's always on the wall and won't come out into the room, like out into 3D space. It's always like this shape on the wall. Then that would be some kind of astral being. But if it comes out from the wall, then you've got some different kind of being. And I mean, I'm no authority on shadow figures. I mean, there are a dime a dozen on the ghost shows. It's like everyone is seeing shadow figures. I mean, that's like, so what? Big deal. It's like everyone sees shadow figures. And then everyone's getting scratched at night too on these ghost shows. Or a lot of people are. Certain ghost shows, they seem to specialize in people that get scratched. And then the person always has a picture of the scratch. You know, it's like the person's asking them about the scratches, like, do you have a picture of these scratches? And they go, yeah, I just happen to have this picture right here of these scratches, which is kind of peculiar in my opinion, but I'm digressing like nobody's business. So let's get back here to this encounter with what appeared to be a negative astral being. Is there a way in which I could discover whether this being is either an unintentional thought form created by my own negative thoughts and feelings or some kind of demon? And setting aside the rather in-depth answer given by Devin, I'm going to have to do the best I can just based on my own knowledge. And for starters, I would say there's not necessarily a difference between a form created by your own negative thoughts and feelings or some kind of demon. That your own negative thoughts and feelings can help to produce this demon, or at least it's creating like an opportunity for the demon to appear, so that, I mean, they would both be the case. You know, it would be both at the same time. And I think in most cases that would be the case, that it's both at the same time. If it's not just something imagined, it's something imagined and sort of a being fitting that imagination at the same time. But I don't think there's any way to know for absolutely certain whether your mind is just creating it or whether it exists independently of your mind. I mean, a lot of people, including me, I mean, to some degree, it's your own karma is creating anything that happens to you. Your own karma is conditioning even the flesh and blood people around you that are interacting with you. So from one point of view, I mean, it's all the fruition of karma. All of your experiences are a fruition of karma to some degree. So, I mean, it would be your own mind. And by strengthening your mind, like I think Devin Wendell was saying, if you've got a really strong aura, it helps to protect you from this kind of thing. So, I mean, strengthening your mind, having a healthy, well-balanced mind that doesn't have like weak spots or cracks or holes or whatever, that things can get through, you know, in order, like the New Testament, it's like everyone and his sister was possessed by evil spirits back then in that particular part of the world. And it's caused by having like certain weaknesses or imbalances in your mind that let stuff through. So I think from the Theravada Buddhist point of view, the best thing to do, in addition to, you know, trying to have a healthy, well-balanced mind, which would be aided by morality and meditation, also, just in case it's really a being, to send metta to this being, send thoughts of friendliness and goodwill towards this being, because beings, you know, whether they're human beings or some other kind of beings, they cause trouble for others because they're unhappy. You know, a happy person is willing to live and let live. They're not going to be fucking with other people. If you're genuinely happy and content, you know, it's, you know, everyone's fine. It's when you're unhappy, you want other people to be unhappy too. So by sending feelings of goodwill and like brotherly love, you know, metta, to a being that's causing problems to you, whether it's your boss or, you know, some teacher that's causing problems, or some bully, or say, for example, some demon, some shadow figure, that it makes it less likely that they will continue to pester you, that they won't try to cause trouble for you. So, but whether it is legit some kind of astral being, or whether it's just your own imagination, or even like RSPK, like recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis coming from your subconscious mind that's generating poltergeist phenomena, still trying to cultivate a healthy, well-balanced mind and just beaming goodwill towards these beings just in case they're real. I mean, that would be about your best protection, or your best way of resolving the situation from a Buddhist point of view. But again, I don't think that it's completely possible for you to know for absolute sure whether a shadow figure, for example, or some being that you encounter in an altered state of consciousness, whether it's just a figment of your own mind, or whether it's genuinely some other being. In fact, I mean, at a deep philosophical level, you can't even prove that the people you're interacting with are real people. You can't just positively demonstrate that. So, yeah, your best bet is just try to have a healthy mind and send metta. And I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from White Ash Piper. And White Ash Piper says, regarding your analysis on Jesus, and he's referring to, I think it was the last question of the most recent Q&A, says, regarding your analysis on Jesus, couldn't the same be said for the Buddha? After all, what was written about Jesus was just 30 years after his execution. I'd say that's fresh meat compared to the 500 years after Buddha's death. I'm not exactly sure what he's referring to specifically with regard to my analysis on Jesus, that it's not entirely accurate, that that I think even back in like the 1980s, I have read that it was the official position of the Vatican, of the Roman Catholic Church, that only about 20% of the words attributed to Jesus in the New Testament are likely to be authentic. And I assume most of the deadwood is coming from the Gospel according to John, where the Buddha's the Jesus is like a broken record, just saying, you have to believe in me, you have to believe in me, you have to believe in me, over and over again. In the synoptic Gospels, so-called, he talks about all sorts of things, but in the Gospel according to John, I mean, he really is just hammering away mainly at this one point. He does say that you should love one another in one part, but for the most part, I mean, he's just saying the same thing over and over again, slightly different ways. But anyways, getting back to the Vatican and its 20% analysis, I would have to guess that the words of the Buddha in the Pali Tipitaka are less than 20% genuine, authentic sayings of Gautama Buddha. And that is, I mean, a lot of people, I mean, I felt this even when I was a monk. I mean, it's just common sense. It's like one thing, like White Ash Piper says, it was hundreds of years, probably, unless the Greeks in like what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan were actually writing stuff down that just hasn't been preserved or hasn't been dug up yet. That things traditionally weren't written down for 500 years after the time of the Buddha. And the Indians really did not have much of a sense of objective history. It's like all kinds of exaggerations and mythology and so forth would get mixed in. And I've read that Indian history didn't even exist until the British took over India and invented it themselves. Just like a systematic approach to studying the history of India was invented by English people, or so I have read. I mean, you did have chronicles and so forth, but the chronicles were not entirely historically objective, sort of like the history of Herodotus. He's like the father of Western history, but not everything that he wrote was legit history. There was just a lot of this legends and myths and stuff mixed in. And that's the way it was in India, and still is to some degree. But yeah, I would say maybe 10% of the Pali Tipitaka would actually like reliably represent what the Buddha taught. I mean, you've got a gradient. First, you've got like verbatim quotes, and I would guess that the amount of verbatim quotes in the Pali Tipitaka would be a relatively small percentage. And then you've got sort of a reasonable paraphrase where the Buddha would agree with it. You know, it's pretty much what he said, just not in exactly those words. There'd probably be more of that. And then there's just stuff that he probably would not have said or did not say, would not have even endorsed. You know, like bragging about how great he is and how people should worship him and so forth. So, yeah, I would say that probably the Pali Tipitaka is somewhat less reliable as an accurate source of information on what the Buddha taught than the New Testament is with regard to Jesus. Although the Buddha seems to have been much more successful as a teacher than Jesus. I mean, it was like his own disciples just didn't understand him. You know, they just declared him the Son of God, at least maybe not his immediate apostles, but certainly, you know, the next generation of Christians, you know, it was just like, he's the Son of God, he died for our sins, and, you know, what he actually taught isn't nearly as important as just believing in him as your savior. So I think the Buddha was much more successful as a teacher. You know, he had many more enlightened, or at least very wise disciples. You know, like St. Peter was one of the main disciples of Jesus. And if we can believe the Bible, I mean, he was like swearing up and down he never met Jesus when he gets encountered on the night of Jesus' arrest. You know, he denies Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed in the morning. You know, you just would find that in like a Pali Sutta with regard to the behavior of Sariputta, for example. Sariputta was an enlightened being, whereas St. Peter and certainly St. Paul, who never met Jesus, but nevertheless was at least as instrumental in modern Christianity as Jesus was, yeah, they just do not come across as enlightened beings. Even the enlightenment of Jesus himself is doubtable. Based on the idea that, you know, he got in foul moods and cried on at least one occasion and so forth. Just based on orthodox Theravada, a fully enlightened being wouldn't behave that way. But then again, I don't think that Theravada Buddhism would necessarily be completely reliable with regard to how an arahant can or cannot behave. Because, I mean, I've got the example of Neem Karoli Baba, again, up there on the altar there, who, I mean, he just behaved like a complete rascal, but he was extremely spiritually advanced, and he kind of, in a way, just kind of tramples on certain dogmatic ideas about what an extremely advanced spiritual being can and cannot do. So, let's see, getting back to White Ash Piper's question here. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what White Ash Piper says here, that with regard to my analysis on Jesus, and I'm not exactly sure what exactly he's referring to with regard to that, but couldn't the same be said for the Buddha? Yeah, to some degree, yeah. But again, I mean, at least the Buddha was more successful in conveying wisdom to his disciples than Jesus was. So that would be a mitigating factor and might boost the percentage of how reliable his recorded teachings are. So I guess I answered that one. I'm not exactly 100% sure what he was referring to, but I answered it as well as my nostrils and I are capable of answering it, because my nostrils are still kind of plugging up in strange ways. And I do hope that I will be better, 100% better, or at least 99% better by the next Q&A. Also, White Ash Piper asks another question here, which is, by the way, I heard it once said that the Buddha might have been murdered being offered the tainted food as an intentional act, And the only place I've ever encountered that is in this really badly written essay by Kid Wheeler, who claims to be the world's leading authority on ancient early Buddhism, and also one of the world's leading authorities on the Pali language, even though he is an inept translator. He gets just easy words wrong. But he was claiming that Mahakassapa, the Buddha's senior disciple at the time of the Buddha's death, he conspired, he participated, he was an accomplice in the murder of the Buddha, also the murder of Sariputta Moggallana, and also Mahavira, the leader of the Jain religion, or the Jain spiritual tradition. And I mean, there's no evidence, really, that the metalsmith, Chanda the metalsmith, deliberately murdered the Buddha by poisoning him, by giving him tainted meat, tainted pork. Or the Mahayana Buddhists would say a poisonous mushroom. But yeah, I mean, there's no indication at all in the texts that he was deliberately murdered. In fact, it is an orthodox tenet of orthodox Theravada Buddhism that a fully enlightened Buddha cannot be murdered. It's impossible. They just don't have the karma to be murdered. You can murder an ordinary arahant, like Mahamoggallana was murdered, but the Buddha cannot be murdered, at least according to Orthodox Theravada. So from the Orthodox position, I mean, the idea really doesn't have a leg to stand on. There's no real evidence other than somebody served the Buddha this pork, or whatever it was. According to Theravada, it was pork, tender pork, sukara, and the Buddha ate it, and then afterwards he died. And then he told somebody, I can't remember who, maybe it was the smith himself, don't serve this pork or the sukara to any other monk, but just throw it away. Nobody else could eat it. And so apparently the Buddha knew, I mean, he was functionally omniscient according to tradition. He was an enlightened being, so that, I mean, if he allowed himself to be poisoned, then he was sort of committing suicide by knowingly eating poison. So, I mean, it's not absolutely inconceivable that the Buddha was deliberately murdered, but there's no indication of it in the texts, or there's no evidence or indication of it outside the text either. It's just like just a wide open conjecture. You know, it's just a complete guess based on a little bit of circumstantial evidence that the Buddha ate something and afterward he died. So, I mean, it could have been poisoned food, and then you take one step further, it could have been deliberately poisoned food for the purpose of killing him, but all it is just a wild conjecture, and it would never stand up in a court of law. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And this is from Luigi, and this is the very last question. In fact, Luigi asked this question just a short time ago today. So he got in right under the wire here. And Luigi says, does Buddhism teach you to negate your drive, to negate your will to power, to negate your lust for success? And in a way it does. You neutralize it. It's considered to be unskillful, unconducive to enlightenment, unless your drive and your lust for success are directed towards enlightenment, the attainment of sagehood. And then still, so long as you have this drive towards enlightenment, you're not going to get enlightened. But what happens is, it's like you've reduced all of your cravings and attachments to this one last craving and attachment for enlightenment. And then eventually you get to the point where you can't get enlightened because you still have this craving, even though it's craving for enlightenment. And so you have to just leave that behind. And sometimes it might just be like a complete just giving up, just letting go of everything and just despair. Or else it could just be this insight, you know, I still have this attachment for becoming enlightened, and so I'll just let go of this attachment, and it turns out that it's the last significant attachment, and then that's it. But yeah, Schopenhauer especially, when I read this question from Luigi, it reminded me of Schopenhauer. And that's basically what Schopenhauer is describing, and how he describes not only Buddhism, but any kind of advanced spiritual method that leads to enlightenment or liberation, including, you know, the more advanced levels of Christianity, is, is that you are denying your will. You know, everything is a manifestation of will, you know, will and representation. So you got this will that wants to, you know, just fill all niches, you know, it just wants to exist in any way it can. And that would correspond to karma in Buddhism, because karma also is will, pretty much in a Schopenhauerian sense. And so the way you free yourself from this veil of tears, this samsara, is not to do what you want to do. It's I think it was Neem Karoli Baba that was saying, you know, if you got a cup of tea there and you want that tea, don't drink it. Whatever it is that you want, don't do it. Ajahn Chah used to teach the same kind of a thing. You just mortify your self-will, which is what St. John of the Cross also was teaching. You know, you mortify your self-will. And then according to St. John of the Cross, the mystical doctor of the Catholic Church, that what happens is when you succeed in mortifying your own self-will, you know, your own will to power, so to speak, then you become like a puppet of God. You become motivated by the will of God rather than your own will. And Buddhists would define it somewhat differently. You know, they'd explain things somewhat differently, but still, an enlightened being creates no karma, and karma is essentially will. So an enlightened being moves through the world effortlessly with no deliberate effort, so to speak. So in a sense, Buddhism does teach you to negate your drive, to negate your will to power, and to negate your lust for success, but it's not entirely negative, because the result of that is infinitely better than anything you can experience as a normie worldling on this planet, in this realm of existence. So it's all for a good cause, supposedly. You know, it's all for the attainment of enlightenment and liberation. So Nietzsche wouldn't like it much. Nietzsche really didn't have much use for Buddhism, but that's okay. And I've just answered the last question. So if you got any questions about Buddhism or ancient India or Eastern spirituality or meditation or whatever you think I might be able to answer, feel free to ask questions in the comments below. Or if you have access to the Discord server, you can ask them there. If you have access to the Subscribe Star channel, you can ask them there. And hit the like button if you like this. If you didn't like it, I don't want you to be dishonest and say that you liked it. And if you haven't subscribed and you think that this is up your alleyway, feel free to subscribe. And be happy. And now I got to do the complicated process of turning this off, because I've got this complicated process here. Like that.